Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. So here's the big question. How does the world's second largest economy maintain this firm, almost unwavering confidence in its own development model, especially when, external analysts are pretty much all pointing towards deflation, a huge property crash, and really weak domestic demand?
Yeah, it's like we're looking at this radical divergence, isn't it? Beijing sees one picture industrial resilience, this big shift to high tech. But the rest of the world looks at the exact same data and sees something else entirely. Fragility, maybe. Masked by strong exports.
Exactly. And our goal here is really to unpack that confidence. We need to dig into the official narrative, especially those key messages from the People's Daily Zonkaiwen editorials. That's where they signal their political priorities, right? Then we take the hard data, the numbers, and we pressure test those official assumptions. We want to figure out what's just rhetoric versus what's genuinely verifiable strength, especially on things like innovation and industrial capacity. Okay, so these editorials, they're not just opinion pieces. They come out ahead of major party meetings. They're basically Beijing telling the world, this is our economic reality as we see it. So what are the core beliefs they're pushing? What are these pillars of confidence?
Right. They've built this narrative around four main pillars, all designed to project this image of a controlled, managed transition. The first one is all about innovation-driven growth. The argument is that the economy's already pivoted. It's moved away from relying so heavily on, say, property investment and traditional labor. Now it's supposedly powered by new things, green tech, advanced manufacturing.
And the big proof point they offer for this, it seems to be just the sheer volume of patent filings, right?
Yeah.
China's way out ahead globally.
That's exactly it. They point straight to the WIPO numbers for PCT filings. That's the international system. China's hitting around, 70,000 international applications this year? Compare that to the U.S. at maybe 54,000. For Beijing, that volume is like definitive proof. It shows the shift to high tech is real, it's happening, and it's succeeding.
Okay, so innovation is pillar one. What's the second pillar holding up this confidence?
Pillar two is resilience. They do acknowledge risks, global protectionism, maybe weaker demand at home, but they frame them as, manageable bumps in the road, nothing fundamental. And the key metaphor they keep repeating is crucial here. China's economy is an ocean, not a pond.
Right, the ocean metaphor, implying it's just too big to be seriously disrupted by waves or external shocks.
Precisely. It's meant to convey scale, depth, and ability to absorb turbulence without changing course.
Interesting. But if they're so inherently stable, why the focus in Pillar 3 on their role in the global system? Seems a bit outward-looking.
Well, I think it's proactive messaging. Pillar 3 presents China as a global stability provider. The argument here is that their policy consistency, their huge predictable market, that's a stabilizing force compared to what they paint as policy chaos or rising protectionism elsewhere. And then finally, Pillar 4 tackles the trade tensions head-on. Export strength. They flatly reject the idea that this strength comes from massive state subsidies. Instead, they insist it's down to their superior governance system, efficiency, sheer scale, and, good long-term planning. It's framed almost as a contribution to global supply chains, not a disruption.
And that argument about export strength, it got a significant political boost from the September trade data, didn't it? Exports were up, 8.3% year on year? But the really key part politically was where that growth came from. It wasn't the U.S. shipments there actually fell sharply. The growth was coming from Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa.
Exactly. That diversification allows Beijing to say, look, global demand for our high-quality goods is fundamentally strong. It doesn't really matter what Washington or Brussels does with tariffs. It plays well domestically, too.
Okay, so that's the official story: innovation, resilience, stability provider, export strength. Sounds pretty robust, backed by that idea of scale.
It does. But now let's shift the lens inward, because if the whole engine relies on resilience, we have to look at the potential weak spots. And the big one seems to be domestic household demand.
Right. What's the biggest single constraint you see right now, the thing that sort of fundamentally undermines that stability claim from the inside?
I think it's the combination of two things, the ongoing structural property drag and this persistent threat of deflation. China's still flirting with deflation, Consumer prices went negative again, producer prices are still contracting, and that kind of environment, that deflationary pressure, it just makes consumers want to hold on to their money, delay spending, save more.
And the property crisis just makes that worse.
Absolutely, because for most Chinese households, their wealth is tied up in property. And S&P is forecasting another 8% drop in primary property sales next year in 2025, with more falls likely in 2026. So until they really fix that structural problem, the property market, the lack of consumer confidence, those strong exports, they aren't just a sign of detached strength. They're actively compensating for really profound softness and, frankly, a lack of confidence at home.
Okay, that brings us back to the innovation narrative then. We mentioned the 70,000 PCT filings, a huge volume. Beijing says patent leadership proves innovation leadership, but for listeners maybe not steeped in patent law, what exactly is a PCT filing? And why isn't just counting them the whole story on innovation quality?
That's a really important distinction to make. So a PCT filing patent cooperation treaty, it's essentially an international application. It reserves your right to seek patent protection in many countries at once. It definitely measures inventive activity. It shows scale, how busy the R&D labs are. But volume doesn't automatically mean high value breakthrough innovation. You can file thousands of patents for very small incremental improvements quite cheaply. It doesn't tell you about the impact.
So if volume isn't the best measure, what should we be looking for? What's the sort of gold standard for verifying genuinely high quality, maybe commercially valuable innovation?
Well, if you want to gauge the kind of breakthroughs that really shift industries, you need to look at quality metrics. Things like how often a patent is cited by later inventions, or even better, the number of triadic patent families.
Triadic families, what's that?
That means a single invention that's been granted protection in the world's 3 major patent offices, the US, Europe, and Japan. Filing in all 3 is expensive. So it shows the inventor really believes the idea has significant global commercial potential. China's volume numbers are impressive, no doubt. But when you look at those higher quality metrics like triadic families, the picture of China's innovation leadership, it's, let's say, much more mixed than the editorial suggests. The official rhetoric tends to gloss over that quality versus quantity difference.
Right, but that commercial impact, mixed or not, is being felt globally.
Yeah.
And that seems to be what's driving these really acute trade tensions now. That pivot they boast about shifting to export advanced manufactured goods, it's creating a huge geopolitical headache, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's the sharp end of their industrial upgrading strategy. We're talking mainly about the new 3 goods: electric vehicles, EVs, batteries, and solar panels. Just look at EVs. Through August this year, EV exports were up something like 26% year on year. That's about $52 billion. I mean, that's incredibly rapid growth. It's undeniable success for China's industrial policy and their manufacturing prowess.
Yeah, you can't argue with the numbers there. Industrial upgrading in action. But how does that success story land in places like Brussels or Washington? How do they interpret it?
And they read it very differently. They see it primarily as overcapacity being dumped onto global markets. The argument from Western governments isn't really that Chinese producers are inefficient. The argument is that this overwhelming export strength is fueled by state-enabled advantages. Things like cheap loans, subsidized land, low power cost advantages that their own domestic companies just don't have access to.
So whether Beijing calls it efficiency or Washington calls it unfair subsidies, the result is kind of the same on the ground, isn't it? We're seeing more anti-subsidy investigations, tariff threats. It's escalating fast.
Precisely. And that creates this fundamental contradiction in Beijing's confident narrative. It's really hard to credibly position yourself as a global stability provider when you're also running these massive high-tech trade surpluses that your major trading partners increasingly see as an existential threat to their own industries, their own manufacturing base, their jobs. The internal confidence might be real based on industrial success, but the external, the geopolitical cost of that success, it's rising sharply.
Looking ahead then, it sounds like the trade environment is actually getting structurally worse, maybe in ways the editorials don't fully capture. You mentioned friction building up.
Yeah, I think so, because both sides, China and the West, seem to be proactively building more permanent administrative friction right into the supply chains. It's becoming systemic.
Can you give an example of how Beijing might sort of managing competition internally, showing that maybe not all of this competitiveness is purely about raw market efficiency?
Sure. Internally, we've seen Beijing starting to step in and curb what they call ruinous competition in some key sectors. Think e-commerce, autos. Now, this kind of policy management, it does help stabilize things, maybe boost profits for the big listed companies, mitigate some deflationary pressure for producers. But yes, it also means that some of the competitiveness they're showcasing isn't purely from free market forces. It's administered competitiveness to some extent.
And what about externally? What does that structural, maybe permanent friction look like between China and its trade partners?
It looks like using procedural levers much more strategically, almost as policy tools. Think about China's control over licenses for exporting rare earths. That acts like a dial they can turn up or down to influence global supply chains whenever they choose. And the U.S. responds with its own targeted measures, right? Things like the threatened 100% tariffs on specific goods like EVs or new controls on exporting advanced software. These kinds of actions, they raise the baseline costs for any multinational operating globally. That friction is just becoming baked into the system now, regardless of temporary truces.
So if the world needs convincing, if Brussels and Washington need proof that Beijing's confidence is actually grounded in sustainable, balanced growth and not just relying on exports to cover up domestic weakness, what would that proof look like? What are the non-negotiables?
Well, I think it has to start by tackling that core weakness we talked about, domestic rebalancing. They need a genuinely credible plan for boosting domestic demand. And this can't just be general stimulus spending. It needs deep structural reforms, things like much stronger social safety nets, better social insurance, maybe targeted fiscal transfers so households actually feel secure enough to spend more freely. Until they fix that high household savings rate, partly driven by insecurity, and address the property drag, they'll always face pressure to export their surplus capacity, and the trade tensions will just continue.
Okay, so fixing demand is crucial. What about proof on the supply side, especially with those overcapacity worries in EVs, solar, batteries?
They need to show some tangible guardrails on capacity. It
Yeah.
means moving beyond just rhetorically denying overcapacity exists. They need to provide more transparent data on actual factory utilization rates, on profitability in those key sectors. They basically need to demonstrate to the world that these industries are healthy, driven by real market demand, and not just operating as state-subsidized export machines flooding global markets.
That sense. And the last piece, the behavioral change need to reduce all that administrative friction you mentioned, the stuff raising costs for everyone.
That comes down to predictable rules and de-escalation. They need to step back from using these long-arm administrative measures like the rare earths licensing controls that function as these constant low-level irritants, these everyday frictions in global supply chains. Basically show that trade policy isn't going to be constantly weaponized day to day. So if you're trying to make sense of all this, what's the key takeaway? I'd say Beijing's confidence is, well, it's adapting and it's real in some ways. It is backed by genuine industrial upgrading and scale. That part's true. But the overall macro engine, it's clearly running with one weak cylinder, and that's domestic household demand. So if the promise they're making is stability, the real proof isn't going to come just from powerful editorials in the People's Daily. The proof will be invisible progress on domestic rebalancing and much more transparency around industrial capacity and its limits. That, I think, is the true test of whether this confidence is sustainable long term.
Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs. And don't forget to like, comment, and share.